Next question. What advice could you give a couple who does not want to seek help? They both know their relationship is unhealthy.
Don't have kids. That's my one piece of advice. It's probably not the best advice, but it's all I can come up with. Do you have any, Alicia?
I guess it would depend on what you mean by unhealthy. If it's unhealthy in terms of physical violence, I don't suggest couples counseling. We really don't suggest that at Friends of the Family because with couples counseling and marriage counseling, typically the blame is placed on both people. So whereas with domestic violence, we teach accountability. So the person who is being the abuser, the person who is the offender, is taking responsibility and accountability for their behavior. Couples counseling, I'm just not a big fan of it because they often put a lot of that responsibility on the victim. So that's a tough one, but I agree with Donna.
Well, I will just add this, though. Sometimes we get, at Friends of the Family, we get maybe from a CPS worker. I had this last week. The CPS worker said, well, we're not sending her to you guys because she wants to stay in her relationship. And I was like, ooh, we don't care. Like, we do not have a dog in the hunt, y'all. We don't care if you want to stay in your relationship. We consider you the expert on your relationship. In fact, sometimes it's more dangerous to leave than it is to stay. And I know that's not a real popular opinion because we want people to get out of abusive relationships, but my grandmother tried to get out of one and she's dead because of it. And so that's oftentimes when people get killed. So, I should say this. Someone may not want to get the help that you're offering, right? But everybody could probably, there's a hook in it for everybody, right? So if they know at Friends of the Family that we're not going to judge them, that we're not going to tell them what to do, but what we're going to do is give them options and let them know what their resources are, that could be very meaningful to someone who's being victimized but really wants to stay in their relationship. One of the best things you can do for that friend is to say, they're not going to tell you what to do. They're not going to judge you. But wouldn't it be good to know if at some point in the future you want to get out, what your options are? Or wouldn't it be great to have someone to go talk to like Alicia that she doesn't care she cares. I shouldn't say that. But she's not going to tell you to leave. Because we don't give that advice. We don't say you need to leave. That's not a part of our languaging around this issue because we don't want to be responsible when we have told somebody you need to leave and they leave and then they die. We consider them the expert of their lives and want to make sure that they have all of the information is power. And so we want to make sure they have all the information they need to make the decisions that suit them best.
If I heard the question correctly, it sounds to me, and I'm not a clinical or counseling psychologist, but it sounds like some counseling is needed, irrespective of whether it is in a traditional couples counseling or with Friends of Family that would be a little more focused on the issues having to do with violence. But it sounds like some counseling is clearly in order.
And from a faith perspective or a biblical perspective, me personally, I don't tell couples to leave. But if you are at a point rationally where you can come to a point of agreement, the Bible do teach us of a point of separation, so we can reconcile. If you're at that point, and like she was saying, your relationship, your partner, if he's or if she's so aggressive where they may harm you, that may not be an option, or it may where you have to prepare yourself where you could almost like do an underground movement where you have to go without them knowing. They have safety plans. I know with Denton County, and I also refer people for that as well as ways of getting out, things to prepare yourself to get out of those relationships. So, but if you feel like if that's something that's holding you because of your faith or your religious beliefs or what you were taught or how you were raised, the Bible do teach of separation because you have to look at the greater evil and the lesser evil of the entire situation. It's not worth losing your life if there is an opportunity for you to move away from that situation.
I'd say if you do have children, though, do think about your children and what they're growing up witnessing. You may be able to, stand a little bit of somebody beating up on you, I don't know why you would, but maybe you can tolerate that. But do think about your children, and often with domestic violence, it's not just with the spouse or girlfriend. The children are victimized also, and they're witnessing that, and you may be raising a future batterer or victim of domestic violence. So if you have children, do think about what they're seeing and what they're being put through also.
All right. I apologize for the noisiness of our location. We're going to...
You should mostly apologize
over.
for the fact that they're having a party.
This isn't a party.
Okay, wait,
y'all?
we're having a party.
No, just me. All right. Next question. Can you talk more about the disparities of reporting domestic violence among the wealthy and the poor?
I'll let Captain Carter talk in just a second, but I will say this, that I don't know that you might find it interesting that the disparity between reporting of family violence between the poor and the wealthy is actually maybe flip-flop from what you believe it is. In our experience, people that are that have less resource rely upon the police in a way that people that have wealth do not. And so, in fact, in terms of reporting, and by reporting we mean contacting local law enforcement, our experience is that you're more likely to see reporting happening in lower to middle income neighborhoods than you are to see it happening in wealthy neighborhoods. When I meet with women that are privileged financially, there's typically never there's never been a report to the police, no matter how extensive the violence has been. The sort of the stigma attached to having the police come into your neighborhood, and because they don't have a common presence in your neighborhood, the attention that it draws is something that is so for folks that have some amount of wealth may not rely upon friends of the family or local law enforcement to solve those problems, which can have very negative results. Some of the homicides that we've experienced in the Dallas-Fort Worth area have not been in very poor neighborhoods, but have been in incredibly wealthy neighborhoods where there hasn't been a history of documented family violence, and yet we've had some pretty heinous acts of family violence occur with the killing of victims or partners or children.
Touched on it. Within our black neighborhood here, the police may respond to disturbances where we know, okay, we believe this is a domestic situation, but often the victim, either because, again, they know this, everybody at church is related to this person, his family lives on the next block, she grew up knowing this person, we may not get the whole story. So we may have half a dozen calls out for various disturbances, loud arguments, but very few actual calls from that victim saying, hey, this man assaulted me. And I spoke about it earlier, why that is. There's generally a reluctance amongst African Americans to get the police involved in their day-to-day lives. So many African Americans are affected by the criminal justice system. They know people that are in jail or on probation or parole, and the victim, really wants the relationship to work. She doesn't want the abuser to be locked away forever or have to pay. Many times the victim is the one who's working, and she's the one who's going to be paying any fines or bail or anything for the person. So in many ways it's a hassle for her to call the police because he's going to be calling her the next day to get out of jail, and she may be the one that has to pay for him to get out of jail. So.
All right, we only have about 10 more minutes, so unfortunately we're not going to get to all of the questions. I apologize in advance if we didn't get to your question, but please feel free to come speak with the panelists after the panel. I'm offering y'all's time for a few minutes, just a few minutes, if you still have questions that were unanswered, but we'll try to get to a few more before we finish. Okay. How does the society in which we live affect the victim and the abuser? There are many reasons why abusers become abusers. Does psychology have anything to do with it?
I'm a little biased. I happen to think psychology has something to do with everything. Certainly sociology as well. So when we're talking about society, that would be more at the group or macro level. It's been talked about in a number of ways already, the role that society plays. Society tends to portray this sort of idea that as an individualist, which we pride ourselves on in this Western society, we need to have control. And it sort of causes a lot of blowback, a lot of problems, especially with respect to issues having to do with the traditional setting where the woman is viewed as the lesser. I have lots of ideas about this, going back to notions of issues having to do with religion and spirituality. The fact of the matter is we live in a patriarchal society. And I think that's where the change has to come. Now, having said that, that's not something that's going to happen overnight, nor is it going to happen in the next 50 years. But the reality is that there are some trends which I'd like to say leave me with some optimism. And a lot of it is evident right here. We have a lot of women who are now going to college, who are now taking control of their lives, who are now starting to make decisions that I'm not going to be a victim nor a volunteer. I'm going to be the best that I can be, whatever that takes. So
I definitely agree with Dr. Foster in the sense that domestic violence is a crime of power and control. So anytime someone exerting physical, emotional, verbal control over another one, that's their attempt to keep them, to exert their power and to have and maintain control. But if you look at media in our society, how many times do we see movies where there's a big fight and then afterwards they're having sex? So a lot of times this violence is confused with passion or love, and it's sexualized. And I think these messages, people internalize those and they think that this is love. If he's fighting with me, if he's intensely jealous, if he doesn't want me to hang out, that means he really cares about me. And I think those are definitely stereotypes that can be seen across ethnicities. It's not just in the African American community too, but those are things that we seek to kind of dispel.
All right, a few more. Can you explain the process of filing for a protective order in Denton County?
Yes. Lavinia, you want me to do it? All right. Just kidding. Yes. So in order to get a protective, so there's all kinds of protective orders now. There are family violence or domestic violence protective orders. There are sexual assault protective orders, and there are now stalking protective orders. Thank you, Texas Legislature, last 2011 session. The most common protective order is the family violence or domestic violence protective order. The folks that can get those protective orders are folks that meet the definition in the family code of a household member, or that you have to have this relationship, a unique relationship. So you have to have been married, dating, have a kid together, lived in the same household together. Am I missing one? I think that those are the primary. Those kind of cover a lot of scenarios. If you are able to establish through some form of evidence, and evidence, by the way, can be your own testimony, okay, that there has been family violence has occurred, and it's likely to occur in the future. And when I say family violence, I don't mean Friends of the Family's very broad definition. I mean the Texas Family Code's very specific definition, which is physical assaults or threats of imminent physical assaults. So probably one of the greatest challenges that we face at Friends of the Family is, and probably the police as well, is that when people call us and they're experiencing really significant emotional abuse, a lot of spiritual violence, some of what Lavinia was talking about, financial control, like we can map it and we see that this is, for us, like an incredibly abusive relationship, but this person doesn't use the tactic or strategy of physical violence, that person is not going to be a candidate for a protective order. All right? Protective orders are specifically intended to protect someone's physical safety. All right. So the way you would go about getting a protective order, in my opinion, is that you would first call friends of the family, because we have folks in our agency that are well skilled at helping you complete the application for a protective order, and we submit it to the Denton County District Attorney's Office, and then we accompany you to the DA's office where they draft what's called an affidavit, and an affidavit is your personal testimony of what has happened that you put in that application. And hopefully it has enough facts in it that a judge would read it and say that there is evidence of clear and present danger based on your testimony alone, and they would sign a temporary protective order that would last you for about 14 to 20 days until your batterer, the respondent in the lawsuit, gets served, so that you've seen that movie, You've Been Served, right? The very terrible one-star movie. Well, you get served, right? Someone hands you papers, you've seen it on Law and Order or something. He gets served with those papers. It tells him he needs to be at a hearing on a certain day at a certain time, and you have to also appear at that hearing. But because you've come to Friends of the Family, you don't have to go by yourself, and we take you into a little special room, and hopefully you don't ever have to see that person, because they will agree to a protective order. And then if they don't agree to one, you have to have a hearing where you have to go in and give your testimony in front of a judge about what's happened. And maybe there are some pictures of what's happened, or you contacted the Denton PD and they did an excellent job and made an arrest at the scene. And so we're going to put on some evidence about that. We might call the patrol officer to testify about what he saw or she saw. And the judge hears your evidence and believes that family violence has occurred, and that if I don't issue this protective order, he may continue this abuse. So I'm going to issue this protective order, and it will last for 2 years.
Thorough. Indeed. All right. Well, I'm just going to have 2 more questions. What resources and solutions can be given for verbal or emotional abuse?
Well, certainly Lalisha can talk about sort of boundary setting and some of that kind of thing. That's kind of a tough question to answer, because it depends on the context of the relationship. Is it a relationship you're done with? And for me, that's a lot of my clients. They come to me and they're done with their relationships, but they're still being verbally and emotionally abused by their partners. So we might have to really talk about some safety planning and some strategies about not engaging with that person if it's not necessary to do so. Might require you to take your Facebook down for a while. Might require you to change your email address. It might require you to change your phone number. It could be very inconvenient for you. If it's that bad. And so what happens for the victim is he's got to make some decisions about what steps they're willing to take to create barriers to being in communication with me. Now, if you're in the relationship and you're trying to address verbal and emotional abuse, I'm going to kind of throw that to Lalisha and maybe Lavinia to talk about, because that's very different from what I'm good at doing.
So depending on if you're still in the relationship, a lot of times we develop coping skills, because depending on how it's affecting you, if it's affecting you not wanting to go to class, not wanting to go to work, your grades are slipping, then there are things that we can do together as far as like increasing your sense of social support. We have groups at Friends of the Family. You can go to a group to kind of regain that sense of social support. And there are other ways that we can help develop some coping skills and improve self-esteem and sense of self-worth too as well. So maybe from Lavinia's.
I would say one thing you can do is identify what verbal and emotional abuse is. To start defining it in your relationship. Truth is that there's probably not a person in this room that's not guilty of a little verbal or emotional abuse at times. They're common things that we do in relationships. We, can be verbally abusive. We can say things that are inappropriate. We can even engage in things that would be considered in our playbook at Friends of the Family emotionally abusive. Walking away from someone and not communicating with them can be a form of emotional abuse. Denying, being in a relationship with someone and punishing them by denying them, not necessarily sex, but denying them intimacy, right, can be a form of emotional abuse. So, one of the ways to stop that is to understand what it is and to identify it. And there's actually some really good books out there on verbal abuse and emotional abuse. 2 books by an author named Patricia Evans, who's written about the verbally abusive relationship and the emotionally abusive relationship. And those are pretty good books. I mean, I don't buy everything she says hook, line, and sinker, but that's okay. We can take what we like and leave the rest, right? But we at Friends of the Family have some really good materials on examples of verbal abuse and emotional abuse. So identifying it might help create a solution for it.
Would anybody like to talk about those identifications that you can make about
Some
examples?
Some examples of verbal abuse or emotional
Yeah,
abuse?
I think that'd be helpful,
Sure. I mean,
if you don't mind.
no, I mean, obviously, name calling is a form of verbal violence. Yeah,
Some of the things that I talked about in some of my work is certainly in the case of Myrtle. It's not her real name. I know that because it happens to be my wife. Include the sort of systematic taunting, sort of the systematic sending of this message that you are less than, that you're not worthy. Anything, and certainly those who are closest to us. You know, somebody once told me that, you know, our friends and our lovers and our family know how to push all of our buttons because they put them there. Mm-hmm. You know, we know the boundaries. We know them sort of inherently. And so anytime we are pushing those boundaries, I think it's something that could constitute what you're calling emotional abuse.
well, and truthfully, we could probably go through the room. What do you think an example of an emotional abuse is or verbal abuse? Anybody got an example? I know you've been thinking about them. Toss one out. Oh, come on. Yes. Jealousy. Oh, that's a great one. Because that's a really good one. What did you have one? Putting someone down? Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Foster read about Myrtle that her husband would tell her that nobody would ever want her, right? It's sort of the breaking down of someone's soul, right? Just sort of making them smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And so those would be jealousy. I think is a really good example. Putting someone down, in other forms. I think a subset of emotional abuse can be the spiritual violence that Lavinia was talking about. Taking your spiritual practice and using it to dominate and control somebody, and that can be very effective. Because if you are a spiritual person and adhere to a certain set of beliefs, and someone that you care about is using those set of beliefs to teach you something that's false, but you don't. It sounds right, and unfortunately, getting reinforced, in various ways, that can be, taking your soul and just crushing it and crushing it and crushing it and crushing it down.
Okay, our last question is, how can domestic violence be prevented?
I'm out. I'm just kidding.
Continue to educate the public, such as projects like this, making you aware of, like we were saying, identifying what abuse is, how it's defined. A lot of times when we think of domestic violence, we think of somebody physically hurting someone else, when in fact it can be spiritual abuse, emotional abuse, like using the word of God or using a point of authority over you because I'm the man, I'm the head. It can be a point of knowing that, some people may say, well, you're too black, nobody ever wants you, or you don't even have your high school diploma, or you don't even have this, and you'll never be anything. It's so many ways, like she said, destroy your soul. So we have to, first be educate ourselves about domestic violence or domestic abuse, relationship violence is what we like to call it now, because it's dealing with various relationships. But I think education is one of the most important things that we have to do to help bring prevention to this in our society.
It's a real big question.
Yeah, it is.
And there's a lot of levels, I think, attached to what we would call prevention. And I'm sure there are lots of opinions about what those levels are. At the macro level, as Vinny just talked about, there's this idea of education / awareness, and that can come in a lot of forms, including forms like there are a number of organizations out there, including some here in Texas, that help to teach women self-defense. So in spite of some of those cultural stereotypes that the captain talked about, the reality is that one of the ways to prevent abuse is to make sure that the perpetrator knows that they are going to be in for a fight. Talking about my own experiences as a child, I remember being probably in grade school and watching my father try to strangle my mother with the cords of the drapes and feeling totally helpless. But later on, having a memory that we share at family reunions still, where my father came home one night drunk and chose to try to abuse my mother, and she grabbed a frying pan and took care of her own self. So that's, in my opinion, another form of prevention.
I think too that it's important to recognize that domestic violence is a choice, and to have our society make correct choices, this prevention needs to start early. So it means going into schools and educating, like Lavinia said, teaching what healthy relationships look like, teaching that healthy relationships involves accountability, respect, trust, support, equality, and it's not based on power and control. So I think that's really key as far as kind of working towards early prevention.
And also empowering, piggybacking off what she was saying, part of what I do is help empower survivors, and not just survivors, but before, I like to call it preventative maintenance, like you do on your car. You do your tune-ups for the weather. You put your, my husband does it, I don't know what that stuff is, but so the car won't tear up in the wintertime, but I call it preventative maintenance. And it empowers you. I like to empower young people to let them know you are somebody, you have worth, you have value. And we have to understand that, and we don't deserve the things that people try to put on us, the abuse, the ridicule, the less than feelings, the talk downs, somebody putting their hands on me. I don't care what I've seen my parents go through, or what I've seen my grandmother go through, or what I've seen in the past, of what movies they put out, or how they, they minimize things or desensitize things in television, that as an African American community, this is acceptable. No, it's not, and we have to realize that we have to, as individuals, believe in ourselves and know what our value, know our own value is what's important. And I like to help empower young people with that, of knowing their value, knowing what they're worth, because you are worth more than what you can imagine, and nobody can take that. You shouldn't allow anybody to take that away from you, because that's what happens when they do that. A lot of times we allow them to do these things, and a predator is what I call them, whether it's sexual violence or domestic violence. They see the weaknesses sometimes in us, and it's up to us to identify our own weaknesses at times, so we can begin to strengthen those things about ourselves, and we can become empowered as individuals, in society.
I think ultimately the prevention question is really answered. I like Dr. Foster making the distinction between macro and micro. So, and I think this applies. I often, when I've trained on this issue over the last 20 years, have said that people batter because the benefits of their behavior outweigh the consequence of their behavior. In other words, they get a benefit at far greater level than they get a consequence, okay? And so the goal, right, is to shift that so that the consequence of using violence in your relationship is outweighs the benefit that you receive from doing it. And the unfortunate thing is that typically when we talk about consequence, the only thing that we usually think about is Captain Carter. And we think about there being a criminal consequence for someone. But we know because we've been doing this pretty good now for the last like 15 or 20 years at least. There's been that trend towards making these arrests, that cannot operate in a vacuum, that a criminal consequence cannot be the only consequence, that there has to be consequence from a coordinated community, that the church has to create a consequence, that your educational institutions have to create consequence, that employers have to create consequence, that your own family can't pretend like something didn't happen when it did, and there has to be consequence within your family when your brother or your brother-in-law or your cousin is violent or behaving in this way, that there be some kind of social consequence for that behavior. And that's when we will start to see a trend in a different direction, I really believe.
Thank you all so much. Can we please give a round of applause? Thank you. And thank you all for your questions. Again, I apologize if we didn't get to your question. We just ran out of time. But we've got prizes. Okay. So I'm going to ask some questions, please.